23-year-old Chandler Halderson sat in the Dane County courtroom with the casual demeanor of someone watching a mildly interesting television program rather than a man on trial for the murder and dismemberment of both his parents. Throughout the weeks of testimony, as prosecutors presented photograph after photograph of scattered human remains, as witnesses described the gruesome discoveries that had been made across multiple Wisconsin counties, as the full scope of his monstrous acts was laid bare before judge and jury, Chandler maintained an expression of detached indifference that would become the defining image of his trial. He whispered to his girlfriend during breaks, occasionally smiling at her as if they were sitting in a coffee shop rather than a courtroom where his life hung in the balance. He studied the crime scene photos with clinical curiosity rather than horror or remorse. And when the evidence became particularly graphic, when the reality of what he had done to the people who had given him life was displayed in unflinching detail, he showed not a flicker of the emotion that any normal human being would feel. This was not the behavior of a man overwhelmed by guilt or struggling with the weight of his actions. This was the behavior of a man who simply did not care, whose capacity for human connection had been replaced by something cold and hollow and terrifying. But for those who had known him, who had watched him construct an elaborate fantasy life built entirely on lies, the emptiness behind his eyes was not a surprise. It was simply the final revelation of who Chandler Halderson had always been beneath the charming surface he presented to the world. The Halderson family had been, by all outward appearances, a portrait of comfortable, middle-class success in the suburban landscape of Windsor, Wisconsin. Their home on Waterview Drive was a testament to decades of hard work and careful planning. A spacious residence in a quiet neighborhood where children played in well-maintained yards and neighbors waved to each other on morning walks. Bart Halderson, the family patriarch, was a man whose life had been defined by dedication and reliability. At 50 years old, he had built a career that provided stability and security for his family, earning the respect of colleagues and the trust of those who worked with him. He was the kind of father who showed up to his children's events, who offered guidance without judgment, who believed in second chances and the power of family to overcome any obstacle. His love for his sons was unconditional, a fact that would be exploited by the very child he trusted most. Krista Halderson, his wife of many years, was equally devoted to her family. At 61, she had spent decades nurturing her children, supporting their dreams, and building a home filled with warmth and encouragement. She was known in the community for her kindness, her willingness to help others, and her unwavering belief in the goodness of her sons. Together, Bart and Krista represented everything that parents aspire to be: supportive, loving, and present in ways that many children never experience. They had no way of knowing that their devotion would be repaid with betrayal of the most terrible kind. Chandler Halderson had grown up in this environment of love and support, enjoying every advantage that caring parents could provide. He was intelligent, charming, and possessed of a confidence that impressed those who met him. From an early age, he demonstrated an ability to navigate social situations with ease, making friends and earning the trust of adults who saw in him the potential for great things. His parents invested in his future, encouraging his interests and providing opportunities that they hoped would lead to success and fulfillment. When he expressed interest in technology and aerospace, they supported his ambitions, proud of their son's lofty goals and confident in his ability to achieve them. They had no reason to doubt him, no indication that the young man they loved was constructing an identity built entirely on fabrication. The lies began small, as such things often do. Minor exaggerations and convenient omissions that allowed Chandler to present himself in the most favorable light. But over time, those small deceptions grew into something far more elaborate, a complete alternate reality in which Chandler Halderson was not an aimless young man struggling to find his place in the world, but a rising star in one of the most prestigious companies on the planet. The centerpiece of Chandler's fantasy life was his claimed employment at SpaceX, the aerospace company founded by Elon Musk that had captured the imagination of a generation with its ambitious goals of space exploration and colonization. According to Chandler, he had secured a position with this elite organization, a job that would take him to exciting places and position him at the cutting edge of human achievement. He spoke of his work with casual confidence, dropping details about projects and colleagues that seemed plausible to parents who had no reason to question their son's honesty. He created fake work emails, fabricated correspondence with supervisors, and constructed an elaborate documentation of a career that existed only in his imagination. When he claimed that his job required him to travel, to work odd hours, to be unavailable at certain times, his parents accepted these explanations without suspicion. They were proud of their son's success, eager to share news of his accomplishments with friends and family who were equally impressed by the young man's achievement. The lie became the foundation of Chandler's existence, a fantasy so thoroughly constructed that it required constant maintenance and elaboration to sustain. But the SpaceX deception was only one layer of the false identity Chandler had created. He also claimed to have earned a college degree, presenting his parents with documentation of academic achievements that he had never actually accomplished. He had attended Madison Area Technical College for a time but had failed to complete his studies, a fact he concealed behind forged transcripts and fabricated graduation ceremonies that he somehow always had a reason for his parents not to attend. The degree was essential to the SpaceX narrative, a prerequisite for the kind of position he claimed to hold. And so it too became part of the elaborate fiction. Each lie required additional lies to support it, a cascading structure of deception that grew more precarious with each passing month. Chandler lived in constant fear of discovery, aware that a single crack in the facade could bring the entire structure crashing down. But rather than confess and face the disappointment of parents who would surely have forgiven him, he chose to burrow deeper into his fantasy, constructing ever more elaborate explanations for the inconsistencies that occasionally arose. His entire identity had become a lie, and the thought of being exposed as a fraud was more terrifying to him than any other outcome he could imagine. The financial implications of Chandler's deceptions were substantial and would eventually become a significant factor in his downfall. Living a double life required resources, money that Chandler did not legitimately possess but needed to maintain the appearance of the successful young professional he claimed to be. He manipulated his parents' trust in various ways, borrowing money for expenses related to his fictional job, requesting assistance with costs that existed only in his imagination, and taking advantage of their generosity in ways they never suspected. The financial drain was gradual but significant, a slow bleeding of resources that Bart and Krista attributed to the normal challenges of supporting an adult child in the expensive early stages of a career. They had no idea that the money they provided was not facilitating their son's professional growth, but rather subsidizing a fantasy that had no connection to reality. As the years passed and the deceptions accumulated, the financial entanglement grew more complex, creating a web of obligations and expectations that Chandler could never legitimately fulfill. The money became another thread in the tapestry of lies, another pressure point that would eventually require more desperate measures to address. The summer of 2021 brought the beginning of the end for Chandler Halderson's elaborate fantasy. The careful structure of lies he had maintained for years was beginning to show cracks that even his considerable skills of manipulation could not conceal. His parents, who had supported him unquestioningly for so long, were beginning to ask questions that had no good answers. The SpaceX job that had seemed so promising had failed to produce the career advancement that should have followed years of employment. The travel opportunities and exciting projects that Chandler described never seemed to materialize into tangible evidence of success. Bart Halderson, whose trust in his son had been unwavering, was starting to notice inconsistencies that troubled him. He began to investigate, to verify the claims that Chandler had made, to seek confirmation of the achievements his son had described. What he found, or rather what he failed to find, raised alarms that could no longer be ignored. There was no record of Chandler's employment at SpaceX. There was no evidence of the degree he claimed to have earned. The entire edifice of his son's adult life appeared to be built on nothing but words and wishes. The confrontation that followed was inevitable. The moment that Chandler had dreaded since the first lie had left his lips. When Bart and Krista sat their son down to demand an explanation for the discrepancies they had discovered, Chandler found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his existence. He could confess, admit that he had been lying for years, face the disappointment and anger of parents who had sacrificed so much for a son who had repaid them with deception. This path would be painful, humiliating, a complete destruction of the identity he had constructed. But it would also offer the possibility of forgiveness, of rebuilding, of finding a genuine path forward with the support of a family that loved him despite his failures. Or he could choose another path, a darker path that would eliminate the threat of exposure entirely by eliminating the people who posed that threat. In the twisted calculus of Chandler Halderson's mind, the choice was somehow not as difficult as it should have been. The prospect of being revealed as a fraud, of losing the identity he had created, of facing the judgment of a world that had believed his lies was more unbearable than the alternative. And so, in the first week of July 2021, Chandler Halderson made a decision that would transform him from a liar into a murderer. The murders of Bart and Krista Halderson were not impulsive acts of violence committed in the heat of confrontation. They were calculated, premeditated crimes that required planning and execution, that spoke to a coldness of purpose that still chills those who contemplate it. Chandler's weapon of choice was a firearm, and he used it to end the lives of both his parents in their own home, the sanctuary that they had built through years of work and sacrifice. The exact sequence of events during those terrible moments remained known fully only to Chandler himself. But the evidence would later reveal that both Bart and Krista met their ends at their son's hands, victims of a child they had loved unconditionally and trusted completely. The betrayal was absolute, a violation of the most fundamental bond that exists between human beings. Parents had died at the hands of their offspring since the beginning of human history. But the cold-blooded nature of these killings, the calculating efficiency with which they were carried out, placed them in a category of horror that even experienced investigators found difficult to process. What followed the murders was perhaps even more disturbing than the killings themselves. A methodical process of disposal that revealed the depths of Chandler's detachment from normal human emotion. He did not panic, did not flee, did not show any of the reactions that might be expected from someone who had just committed the ultimate transgression. Instead, he began the grim work of concealing his crimes, dismembering the bodies of his parents with a clinical efficiency that suggested either prior planning or a capacity for dissociation that bordered on the psychopathic. He scattered their remains across multiple locations in Wisconsin, traveling to remote areas where he believed the evidence of his crimes would never be found. Body parts were discovered in Dane County, in rural areas miles from the family home, hidden in locations that only a local with knowledge of the terrain would have known to use. The dismemberment and dispersal served a practical purpose in Chandler's mind, making identification of the remains more difficult and creating confusion about where the actual crime had occurred. But it also served as a final act of dehumanization, reducing the parents who had loved him to mere problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed and discarded like unwanted garbage. With his parents dead and their remains scattered across the Wisconsin landscape, Chandler Halderson returned to his life as if nothing had happened. The transition from murderer to grieving son was apparently seamless, requiring no adjustment period, no time to compose himself or construct an emotional response to the horror he had committed. On July 7, 2021, he walked into the Dane County Sheriff's Office and reported his parents missing, expressing concern for their welfare with a convincing display of worried confusion that initially fooled the investigators he encountered. According to Chandler's account, his parents had left for a trip to their cabin on July 1st and had failed to return or make contact since then. He described attempts to reach them by phone, growing concern as the days passed, and finally the decision to seek help from law enforcement. It was a plausible story, delivered with appropriate emotion, and there was no immediate reason for investigators to suspect that the young man before them was anything other than a son worried about his parents' safety. The missing persons investigation was opened, and the search for Bart and Krista Halderson began. But even as Chandler played the role of the concerned son, investigators began to notice details that did not quite fit the narrative he presented. His affect seemed slightly off, his emotional responses not quite matching the circumstances he described. Experienced detectives develop an instinct for deception. a sensitivity to the subtle cues that distinguish genuine distress from performance, and something about Chandler Halderson triggered that instinct almost immediately. They began to investigate not just the disappearance, but the person reporting it, quietly gathering information about the young man's background and circumstances. What they found was troubling. The SpaceX job that Chandler had described did not exist. The college degree he claimed to have earned was a fabrication. The successful young professional he presented himself as was a fiction. A character in a story that had no connection to reality. The discovery of these lies did not prove that Chandler had harmed his parents, but it established a pattern of deception that transformed him from a worried son into a person of interest whose every statement required verification. The investigation expanded rapidly as more information came to light. Investigators executed search warrants on the Halderson family home, looking for evidence that might explain what had happened to Bart and Krista. What they found was a crime scene that had been cleaned, but not thoroughly enough to eliminate all traces of what had occurred there. Forensic technicians discovered evidence of blood in areas of the home, traces that Chandler had failed to completely remove despite his efforts to sanitize the scene. The evidence suggested that violence had occurred within the house, contradicting Chandler's account of parents who had simply left for a vacation and failed to return. Investigators also examined electronic evidence, phone records, and internet searches that would prove devastating to Chandler's claims of innocence. His own devices revealed searches that no innocent person would have conducted, inquiries about body decomposition, methods of disposal, and other topics that spoke to a guilty mind planning its cover-up. The digital trail that Chandler had left behind became another nail in the coffin of his deception, evidence that he had not simply stumbled into tragedy, but had anticipated and planned for it. The search for the Haldersons' remains became a massive undertaking that would ultimately span multiple counties and involve dozens of investigators and volunteers. Acting on tips and leads developed through careful detective work, search teams fanned out across rural Wisconsin, combing through forests, fields, and waterways for any sign of the missing couple. The first significant discovery came on July 14th, when remains later identified as belonging to Krista Halderson were found on a property in Dane County. The condition of the remains confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect, that the Haldersons had not simply disappeared, but had been the victims of violence. Subsequent searches yielded additional remains, body parts scattered across a wide area, in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to prevent identification and confuse the investigation. The discoveries were grim work, requiring investigators to confront the physical evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. Each new find added to the picture of what had happened, building a case that would eventually prove overwhelming. The forensic identification of the remains was a painstaking process that relied on both traditional and advanced techniques. DNA analysis confirmed what the circumstantial evidence had suggested, that the scattered remains belonged to Bart and Krista Halderson. The medical examiner documented the evidence of dismemberment, the tool marks and cut patterns that told the story of how the bodies had been processed after death. This evidence would prove crucial in establishing not just that the Haldersons were dead, but that their deaths had been followed by acts of deliberate concealment that required time, planning, and a complete absence of normal human restraint. The reports generated by the forensic team would become central exhibits in the trial that followed. Clinical documentation of horrors that words alone could not adequately convey. Chandler Halderson was arrested on July 15, 2021, just over a week after he had reported his parents missing. The charges were as severe as the evidence warranted: 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of mutilating a corpse. He was taken into custody without incident, his demeanor reportedly calm and controlled, even as investigators formally accused him of murdering and dismembering his own parents. The arrest was announced at a press conference that drew significant media attention, the case having already attracted interest due to its disturbing nature and the questions it raised about how a son could commit such acts against the parents who had loved him. The community of Windsor, which had followed the missing persons case with concern and hope, now confronted the horrifying reality that the danger had come from within, that one of their own had committed acts of violence that shattered any illusion of suburban safety. The reaction to Chandler's arrest rippled through the various circles of his life. leaving shock and disbelief in its wake. Friends who had believed his stories of SpaceX success struggled to reconcile the charming young man they knew with the monster now described in news reports. Extended family members grappled with grief for Bart and Krista, alongside the impossible reality that their deaths had come at the hands of their own child. The community of Windsor mourned not just the loss of two respected residents, but the destruction of their sense of security, the revelation that the Nice family on Waterview Drive had been harboring a tragedy that no one had seen coming. Vigils were held, memories were shared, and the process of collective grief began. A process that would continue through the months of legal proceedings that lay ahead. Bart and Krista Halderson were remembered as the loving, supportive parents they had been. Their lives celebrated, even as the manner of their deaths cast a shadow over everything. In the Dane County Jail, Chandler Halderson awaited trial with the same unsettling calm that had characterized his behavior since his arrest. He met with his court-appointed defense attorneys, participated in the legal process with apparent cooperation, and gave no outward sign of the remorse that might be expected from someone facing the consequences of such terrible crimes. His behavior behind bars was reportedly unremarkable. Neither the desperate denial of an innocent man nor the tortured guilt of a murderer confronting the weight of his actions. He existed in a kind of emotional limbo, disconnected from the reality of his situation in ways that troubled those who observed him. Psychological evaluations were conducted, experts attempting to understand the mind that had conceived and executed such a calculated betrayal of family trust. The results suggested a personality characterized by narcissism, a grandiose sense of self that could not tolerate the exposure of inadequacy, and a profound deficit in the capacity for empathy that allowed him to view other people, even his own parents, as obstacles rather than human beings with intrinsic value. The pre-trial period was consumed by the legal maneuvering that characterizes any major criminal prosecution. The defense explored various strategies, considering challenges to evidence and arguments that might mitigate their client's exposure. But the strength of the prosecution's case was overwhelming. A wall of physical evidence, digital records, and circumstantial proof that left little room for reasonable doubt. The forensic evidence placed the crimes at the Halderson home and linked the scattered remains definitively to Bart and Krista. Chandler's internet searches revealed a consciousness of guilt and evidence of planning that undermined any claim of impulse or accident. His elaborate history of lies provided a motive, the desperate need to prevent the exposure of his deceptions that made sense of what might otherwise seem senseless. The prosecution, led by experienced attorneys who had handled complex cases before, prepared to present a case that would leave the jury with no choice but conviction. As the trial date approached, the media attention intensified. The case had captured the public imagination in the way that particularly disturbing crimes sometimes do, becoming a topic of discussion on true crime podcasts, social media forums, and news programs across the country. The combination of elements was irresistible to those fascinated by the darker corners of human behavior. There was the elaborate web of lies, a young man who had constructed an entire false identity to avoid the judgment of disappointed parents. There was the brutality of the crimes themselves, not just murder, but dismemberment and dispersal of remains in a calculated attempt to avoid detection. And there was the chilling calm with which Chandler had reported his parents missing, playing the role of worried son while knowing exactly where their remains lay scattered. Each element fed into a narrative of sociopathic detachment that both horrified and fascinated those who followed the case. Chandler Halderson became a symbol, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk behind the most ordinary suburban facades. The prosecution team finalized their strategy in the weeks before trial, organizing the mountain of evidence into a coherent narrative that would guide the jury through the horror of what had happened on Waterview Drive. They prepared witnesses who would testify to the investigation's progression, from the initial missing persons report through the gruesome discoveries and the arrest. They organized forensic experts who would explain the scientific evidence linking Chandler to the crimes, the DNA matches, and tool mark analyses that transformed suspicion into proof. They gathered the digital evidence, the damning internet searches and electronic communications that revealed a guilty mind, and prepared to present it in ways the jury could understand. And they coordinated with members of the Halderson extended family, individuals who would eventually deliver victim impact statements that would put human faces on the crime's toll. The goal was not merely to prove that Chandler Halderson had killed his parents, but to ensure that the jury understood the full scope of his betrayal, the years of lies that had preceded the violence, and the callous disposal of remains that had followed it. The defense faced an impossible task, and everyone involved knew it. The evidence was too strong, the digital trail too damning, the physical proof too conclusive for any reasonable claim of innocence. The defense strategy would therefore focus not on acquittal, but on challenging specific aspects of the prosecution's case, creating small doubts that might, perhaps, influence sentencing even if they could not secure a verdict. They would question the reliability of certain forensic techniques, challenge the interpretation of electronic evidence, and attempt to humanize their client in ways that might generate sympathy, or at least understanding, from jurors who would otherwise see only a monster. It was a difficult brief, requiring attorneys to advocate zealously for a client whose crimes generated visceral revulsion. But such advocacy was the foundation of the legal system, and Chandler's lawyers were prepared to fulfill their ethical obligations regardless of their personal feelings about the man they represented. The community of Windsor settled into a grim anticipation as the trial approached, knowing that the proceedings would reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. The Halderson family home on Waterview Drive stood as a silent monument to the tragedy, its windows dark, its yard untended, a physical reminder of the lives that had been destroyed within its walls. Neighbors drove past with averted eyes, unable to look at the house without seeing the horror they now knew had occurred there. The normal rhythms of suburban life continued around this void. Children going to school, adults going to work, the machinery of everyday existence grinding on despite the darkness that had touched this particular corner of the community. But something had changed in Windsor, a loss of innocence that would never fully recover. The Halderson case had proven that evil could take root anywhere, that the family next door might be harboring secrets too terrible to imagine. It was a lesson no one had wanted to learn, and one that would not be easily forgotten. In the final days before trial, the various participants prepared themselves for what lay ahead. Prosecutors reviewed their evidence and rehearsed their presentations. Defense attorneys finalized their approach and prepared their client for the ordeal to come. Witnesses steeled themselves for the experience of testifying, the challenge of recounting horrors in a public forum while maintaining the composure the legal system required. And somewhere in the Dane County Jail, Chandler Halderson waited, his thoughts and feelings hidden behind the same mask of calm that had characterized his behavior since the beginning. Whatever he felt about the proceedings that would determine his fate, whether fear or resignation or something darker, remained invisible to those around him. He had spent years constructing a false persona to present to the world. And even now, facing the consequences of that deception, he seemed unwilling or unable to reveal what lay beneath the surface. The trial would expose the facts of his crimes, but the deeper truth of who Chandler Halderson really was might remain forever hidden, a mystery that no verdict could fully resolve. The legal proceedings against the Crumbley family would span more than 2 years, a marathon of courtroom drama that would test legal theories never before applied in American jurisprudence. Ethan Crumbley's case moved forward first, the juvenile shooter facing charges as an adult for the murders he had committed. His parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, would face their own trials separately, each prosecuted individually for involuntary manslaughter in connection with the deaths of the 4 students their son had killed. The separation of the cases was strategic, allowing prosecutors to focus on different aspects of culpability while building a comprehensive narrative of family dysfunction that had enabled tragedy. The victims' families would endure the ordeal of 3 separate proceedings, reliving their trauma with each new trial, waiting through years of legal maneuvering for the justice that might bring some measure of closure. And the nation would watch, recognizing that the outcomes of these cases would establish precedents that could reshape how American society thought about parental responsibility, gun access, and the prevention of school violence. Oxford, Michigan, had become an unlikely laboratory for legal innovation, the site of experiments in accountability that would have implications far beyond the borders of this small, devastated community. Ethan Crumbley's journey through the legal system began with his arraignment on charges that reflected the full severity of his crimes. He was charged as an adult with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 7 counts of assault with intent to murder, 12 counts of possession of a firearm in the commission of a felony, and 1 count of terrorism causing death. The terrorism charge was particularly significant, reflecting prosecutors' view that the shooting was designed to intimidate and terrorize the school community, rather than simply to harm specific individuals. As a minor being tried as an adult, Ethan faced the possibility of life in prison without parole, the most severe sentence available under Michigan law for defendants who committed their crimes before the age of 18. His defense team, court-appointed attorneys tasked with representing a client whose guilt was not in question, focused their efforts on the sentencing phase, hoping to argue for a lesser sentence that would allow for the possibility of eventual release. The legal strategy was clear from the outset. Ethan would plead guilty to the charges against him, accepting responsibility for the murders, and the battle would be fought over whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison or retain some hope of eventual freedom. The guilty plea came in October 2022, nearly a year after the shooting, when Ethan Crumbley stood before Judge Kwame Rowe and admitted to each of the charges against him. His voice was flat as he acknowledged killing Tate Myre, Hannah Street Juliana, Madison Baldwin, and Justin Schilling. He admitted to wounding 7 other students, to bringing a firearm to school with the intent to use it, to committing acts designed to terrorize the Oxford High School community. The plea was comprehensive, leaving no room for appeals based on disputed facts. No opening for future claims that he had not understood what he was doing. His attorneys had presumably counseled him that a guilty plea was his only viable option, that fighting the charges at trial would only result in the same conviction with the added trauma of forcing victims' families to testify and relive their losses. By pleading guilty, he acknowledged his crimes and positioned himself to argue at sentencing that he was a mentally ill teenager who deserved some possibility of rehabilitation rather than permanent incarceration. The plea was accepted by the court, and the case moved toward the sentencing hearing that would determine whether Ethan Crumbley would ever again breathe free air. The sentencing hearing for Ethan Crumbley became a venue for the presentation of evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of the factors that had contributed to his crimes. Prosecutors presented the case for life without parole, arguing that the premeditated nature of the attack, the number of victims, and the lack of genuine remorse demonstrated by the defendant all warranted the most severe sentence available. They introduced evidence of his planning, the journal entries that documented his descent into violence, the video he had recorded before the shooting, in which he discussed his intentions with chilling calm. They described the impact on the victims' families, the lives that had been destroyed, the futures that would never be realized. Their argument was that some crimes were so severe that rehabilitation was beside the point, that society's need for protection and the demands of justice required permanent incarceration, regardless of the defendant's age at the time of the offense. The 4 students who had died deserved a sentence that reflected the enormity of what had been taken from them, and anything less than life without parole would be an insult to their memory. The defense presented its case for a lesser sentence, with the desperation of attorneys who knew the odds were against them. They called mental health experts who testified about Ethan's psychological state, describing a young man who had been suffering from severe mental illness that had gone undiagnosed and untreated. They presented evidence of his home environment, the neglect and dysfunction that had characterized his upbringing, the parents who had failed to recognize or respond to his deteriorating condition. They argued that a 15-year-old brain was not fully developed, that adolescents were capable of change in ways that adults were not, that condemning a teenager to die in prison was a rejection of the possibility of redemption that the justice system should preserve. Their argument was not that Ethan's crimes were excusable, but that his youth and mental illness should be considered mitigating factors that justified a sentence allowing for the possibility of eventual release. They asked the court to impose a sentence that included the possibility of parole, acknowledging that any release would be decades away but preserving the hope that rehabilitation might someday be possible. The victim impact statements delivered at Ethan's sentencing hearing were among the most powerful testimony the courtroom would hear throughout the entire Crumbly saga. One by one, the families of the 4 murdered students rose to address the court and the defendant, their words carrying the weight of grief that no sentence could adequately address. Tate Myers' family spoke of the athlete and scholar whose life had been cut short, whose dreams of playing football in college would never be realized, whose presence had been a source of joy to everyone who knew him. They described the void his death had left, the family gatherings that would forever feel incomplete, the milestones that would pass without him. Their pain was raw and unfiltered, the authentic voice of people whose world had been shattered by violence that should never have occurred. They asked the court to impose the maximum sentence, to ensure that the person who had taken their son would never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. Hannah Street, Juliana's family, spoke of a 14-year-old girl who had barely begun to discover who she would become, whose potential would never be realized, whose absence left a hole in their lives that nothing could fill. They described her personality, her dreams, the small moments of everyday life that they would never experience with her again. They confronted Ethan directly, asking him how he could have taken their daughter's life, demanding to know if he understood the magnitude of what he had done. Their words were heavy with a grief that seemed almost too large to contain within the confines of language. A sorrow so profound that it threatened to overwhelm the formality of legal proceedings. They too asked for the maximum sentence, expressing their belief that someone who could commit such violence should never again walk free among potential victims. Madison Baldwin's family spoke of a senior who had been months away from graduation, whose college acceptance letters had arrived in mailboxes that she would never check, whose future had been stolen just as it was about to begin. They described her academic achievements, her creative talents, the personality that had drawn friends to her throughout her young life. They spoke of the morning of November 30th, how normal it had seemed, how impossible it was to believe that by the end of the day, their daughter would be dead. They expressed the particular cruelty of losing a child so close to adulthood, of having invested 17 years of love and sacrifice only to have it erased in a moment of senseless violence. Their plea for the maximum sentence was grounded in a desire for justice that could never truly be satisfied, a recognition that no punishment could bring Madison back, but that accountability required consequences commensurate with the crime. Justin Schilling's family spoke last, their words carrying the accumulated weight of all the grief that had preceded them. They described a young man whose character had impressed everyone who encountered him, whose 17 years had been marked by kindness and achievement, whose death had left wounds that would never fully heal. They spoke of the plans he had made for his senior year, the experiences he would never have, the adult he would never become. They confronted the reality that their son's killer was only slightly older than his victims, acknowledging the complexity of punishing a teenager while insisting that the severity of the crimes demanded the most severe response. Their statement concluded with a direct address to the court, asking that Ethan Crumbly never be given the opportunity to walk free, that the memory of their son and the other victims be honored with a sentence that reflected the permanence of their loss. Judge Rowe's sentencing decision came after lengthy consideration of the evidence and arguments presented by both sides. His statement from the bench addressed both the defendant and the broader issues raised by the case, acknowledging the difficulty of sentencing a juvenile offender for crimes of such magnitude. He spoke of the victims, honoring their memory and acknowledging the profound loss their families had suffered. He addressed the question of mental illness and parental neglect, recognizing that these factors had contributed to the tragedy, while concluding that they did not diminish the defendant's responsibility for his actions. He noted that Ethan had made choices, had planned the attack over an extended period, had proceeded with the shooting despite opportunities to stop. These choices, regardless of the psychological and environmental factors that had influenced them, were ultimately his own, and he bore responsibility for their consequences. The sentence was delivered with the gravity that the moment demanded. For each of the 4 counts of first-degree murder, Judge Rowe imposed a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentences would run consecutively, ensuring that even if some future legal development affected one conviction, the others would keep Ethan incarcerated for the remainder of his natural life. Additional sentences were imposed for the assault charges and weapons offenses, adding years to a term that was already permanent. Ethan Crumbley, who had been 15 years old when he murdered his classmates, would never again experience freedom. He would grow old behind prison walls, watching the world change through the narrow window of incarcerated existence, living with the knowledge that his choices had destroyed not only 4 young lives, but his own as well. The sentence was the maximum available under Michigan law, a statement by the court that some crimes were too severe for any consideration of rehabilitation, that some offenders had forfeited any claim to eventual release through the magnitude of their offenses. Ethan's reaction to the sentence was observed carefully by everyone in the courtroom. Observers searching for any sign of the emotion that the moment demanded, he stood impassively as the judge pronounced his fate, his expression revealing little of whatever was occurring within. He did not cry, did not collapse, did not display the despair that might be expected from a teenager learning he would die in prison. Whether this flatness reflected psychological dissociation, medication effects, or genuine indifference to his fate was impossible to determine. He was led from the courtroom by deputies. The first chapter of his legal odyssey concluded, his future reduced to the unchanging routines of maximum security incarceration. The families of his victims watched him go, their expressions mixing grief with something that might have been satisfaction, the knowledge that at least this portion of justice had been achieved. But their ordeal was not over. 2 more trials awaited, proceedings that would test whether the parents whose failures had enabled this tragedy could also be held accountable for its consequences. The trial of Jennifer Crumbley began in January 2024, more than 2 years after the shooting. In a proceeding that would make legal history, she was charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, the prosecution alleging that her gross negligence had contributed to the deaths of the 4 students killed by her son. The theory of the case was straightforward but unprecedented. By purchasing a gun for a mentally troubled teenager, by ignoring warning signs that should have demanded intervention, by refusing to take her son home on the morning of the shooting, Jennifer Crumbley had created the conditions that made the tragedy not just possible, but foreseeable. Her failures as a parent were not merely unfortunate but criminal, rising to the level of conduct that the law could and should punish. If the jury agreed, she would become the first parent in American history convicted for a mass shooting committed by her child, a precedent that would reshape how society thought about parental accountability. The prosecution's presentation against Jennifer Crumbley was methodical and devastating, building a timeline of negligence that left little room for any interpretation other than criminal failure. Prosecutors introduced the text messages that showed her dismissing her son's mental health concerns, the casual LOL response to his ammunition search at school, the social media posts celebrating the gun purchase without any apparent awareness of the risk it created. They called witnesses who could testify to Ethan's deteriorating mental state, experts who explained how obvious the warning signs should have been to any attentive parent. They presented the journal entries that documented his descent into violence, arguing that a mother who was paying attention would have discovered these writings and intervened before tragedy struck. They described the morning meeting at the school, the drawing that screamed for help, the recommendation that she take her son home, and her refusal to do so because work was apparently more important than her child's obvious crisis. The portrait that emerged was of a mother so disconnected from her son's life that she had failed to notice he was planning murder, and so indifferent to his struggles that she had ignored every opportunity to prevent it. Jennifer Crumbley took the witness stand in her own defense, a decision that proved to be a strategic error of significant magnitude. Her testimony was meant to humanize her, to present her perspective on events that the prosecution had characterized in the harshest possible light. Instead, it reinforced the impression of a woman whose priorities had been fatally misaligned, whose understanding of her parental responsibilities was deeply flawed. She testified that she had trusted her husband to secure the gun, that she had not known her son was struggling to the degree that the evidence suggested, that she had believed the school's concerns on the morning of November 30th were not as urgent as they apparently were. Under cross-examination, prosecutors dismantled these claims with the evidence of her own words, the text messages, and social media posts that contradicted her testimony. She was confronted with her dismissive response to Ethan's mental health concerns, her failure to follow up on his reported hallucinations, her LOL reaction to the ammunition search. Her attempts to explain these communications only made things worse, revealing a thought process so detached from normal parental instincts that the jury could not help but conclude that the prosecution's characterization was accurate. The jury deliberated for approximately 11 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Jennifer Crumbley stood expressionless as the verdict was read, her composure maintained through what must have been a moment of devastating realization. She had become the first parent in American history convicted for a mass shooting committed by her child, a distinction that would follow her for the rest of her life. The verdict established a precedent that would have implications far beyond this single case, demonstrating that parental negligence could be prosecuted when its consequences were foreseeable and severe. The legal theory that had seemed novel when charges were first filed had been validated by 12 citizens who had reviewed the evidence and concluded that Jennifer Crumbley's failures rose to the level of criminal conduct. Her sentence would be determined later, but the conviction itself was the crucial milestone, the moment when the law declared that parents could not escape accountability simply because their child was the one who pulled the trigger. James Crumbley's trial followed in March 2024, a proceeding that would test whether the same legal theory could produce the same result against the father, whose role in the tragedy had been different but equally significant. The prosecution's case against James focused heavily on his purchase of the gun and his failure to secure it, emphasizing that he had placed a deadly weapon directly in the hands of his troubled son. Prosecutors argued that James knew about Ethan's mental health struggles, knew that his son was in crisis, and nevertheless chose to give him access to a firearm that was then used to kill 4 people. They introduced evidence of his awareness of the warning signs, his participation in the morning meeting at the school, his failure to search his son's backpack or ask about the whereabouts of the gun he had purchased just days earlier. The portrait of James Crumbley that emerged from the prosecution's presentation was of a father who had armed a killer through a combination of indulgence and neglect, whose desire to give his son a Christmas present had outweighed any consideration of the risks involved. The defense strategy in James Crumbley's trial attempted to distinguish his case from his wife's, arguing that the evidence against him was less damning and that he had been less aware of the warning signs than Jennifer had been. Defense attorneys emphasized that James had not been the one dismissing Ethan's mental health concerns via text message, that his interactions with his son had been less documented, and therefore less subject to the prosecutorial interpretation that had doomed Jennifer. They argued that purchasing a gun for a teenager was not inherently criminal, that millions of American parents did so without their children committing violence. That hindsight was distorting what had seemed like a normal decision into something sinister. They challenged the notion that James should have searched Ethan's backpack on the morning of November 30th, arguing that parents did not routinely rifle through their children's belongings and that the expectation was unreasonable given what James knew at the time. But the evidence against James Crumbley was ultimately too similar to the evidence that had convicted his wife. He had purchased the gun. He had failed to secure it. He had been present at the meeting where the school expressed urgent concern about his son's mental state. He had not disclosed the existence of the firearm or asked to search his son's belongings. He had left the school and returned to work while his son, armed with the weapon James had provided, remained in the building that would become the scene of a massacre. The jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. James Crumbley had joined his wife in the history books, the first parents ever convicted for a mass shooting committed by their child. Their failures now officially designated as crimes by the American legal system. The sentencing of Jennifer and James Crumbley took place in April 2024, proceedings that would determine the actual consequences of their historic convictions. Judge Cheryl Matthews presided over both hearings, understanding that her sentences would set a precedent for how the legal system responded to parental negligence in cases of youth violence. The victims' families once again delivered impact statements, their grief no less raw for having been expressed multiple times before. They spoke of their continued suffering, of the anniversaries and birthdays that had passed without their children, of the ongoing trauma that the trials had forced them to relive. They asked for the maximum sentences, expressing their belief that James and Jennifer Crumbley deserved to face significant prison time for the roles they had played in enabling the tragedy. Jennifer Crumbley's sentencing hearing included her own statement to the court, an opportunity to express remorse that many observers felt should have come much earlier. She apologized to the victims' families, acknowledged that she had failed as a parent, and asked for mercy from a court that had already found her criminally responsible for 4 deaths. Her words were received with skepticism by some who had watched her testimony at trial, who had seen her deflect responsibility onto her husband and her son rather than accepting her own culpability. The sincerity of her remorse was questioned by those who believed she was simply saying what she thought would reduce her sentence, performing contrition rather than genuinely experiencing it. Judge Matthews listened to her statement, considered the arguments of both prosecution and defense, and then imposed a sentence of 10 to 15 years in prison, the maximum available under Michigan law for involuntary manslaughter. James Crumbley received an identical sentence at his separate hearing, 10 to 15 years, for his role in enabling the murder of 4 students. The judge noted the similarity of the parents' culpability, the ways in which each had contributed to the conditions that made the shooting possible. She spoke of the warning signs that had been ignored, the opportunities for intervention that had been missed, the profound failure of parental responsibility that the evidence had revealed. The sentences were intended to reflect the seriousness of the offenses while acknowledging that the Crumbleys, unlike their son, had not directly committed murder. They would serve significant prison time, would be middle-aged or elderly by the time they became eligible for release, would live with the consequences of their failures for the rest of their lives. But they would not die in prison as their son would, their punishment proportional to their role as enablers rather than perpetrators. The convictions and sentences of James and Jennifer Crumbley sent shockwaves through the American legal and educational communities, establishing precedents that would influence how similar cases were handled in the future. Prosecutors in other jurisdictions began examining whether parents of juvenile offenders could be held criminally responsible for failing to secure weapons, for ignoring warning signs, for refusing to get mental health treatment for troubled children. Schools revised their protocols for dealing with concerning behavior, recognizing that the Oxford case had demonstrated the inadequacy of simply calling parents and hoping they would do the right thing. Gun safety advocates cited the Crumbley convictions as evidence that parents who failed to secure their firearms should face legal consequences when those weapons were used in violence. The case became a reference point in policy discussions, in legal education, in the ongoing national conversation about how to prevent school shootings that seem to occur with depressing regularity. The community of Oxford, Michigan, continued its slow process of healing, a journey that would never truly be complete. Memorials to the 4 murdered students remained at the site of the shooting, gathering places for those who wished to honor their memory. The high school itself had become a symbol of tragedy, its name forever associated with the violence that had occurred within its walls. Students who had witnessed the shooting carried psychological scars that would influence the rest of their lives, some struggling with PTSD and other trauma-related conditions that required ongoing treatment. Parents who had sent their children to school that morning expecting a normal day had been permanently changed by the experience of wondering whether their child was among the dead, of waiting in agonized uncertainty for news that might shatter their world. The community pulled together in the way that communities do after tragedy, finding strength in shared grief and shared determination to prevent such things from happening again. The legacy of the Crumbley case extended far beyond the immediate participants, raising questions that American society would continue to grapple with for years to come. How could parents be expected to recognize when their children were planning violence? What obligations did schools have when they identified concerning behavior? And what authority should they possess to override parental decisions? How could firearms be kept out of the hands of troubled teenagers in a country where gun ownership was constitutionally protected and culturally celebrated? What role should mental health treatment play in preventing violence? And how could access to such treatment be improved for families who might not recognize its necessity? The Oxford shooting and its aftermath did not answer these questions, but it forced them into the national consciousness with an urgency that could not be ignored. The convictions of James and Jennifer Crumbley demonstrated that the law was evolving, that accountability was expanding, that parents could no longer assume they would escape consequences simply because they had not pulled the trigger themselves. In their respective prisons, the three members of the Crumbley family began serving sentences that would consume much of their remaining lives. Ethan would never leave custody, his existence reduced to the routines of maximum security incarceration, until death eventually claimed him. James and Jennifer would spend years behind bars, their marriage destroyed by the tragedy they had enabled, their futures defined by the failures that had brought them to this point. Whatever they had hoped to achieve through their parenting, whatever dreams they had held for their family, had collapsed into the rubble of 4 young lives lost and a community shattered. They had become cautionary tales, examples of what could happen when parents failed in their most fundamental responsibilities, symbols of a tragedy that should never have occurred. And in the memories of those who loved them, Tate Myre, Hannah Street Juliana, Madison Baldwin, and Justin Schilling lived on. They were remembered at anniversary gatherings, their names spoken at graduation ceremonies, where their seats sat empty, their photographs displayed in homes and schools across Oxford. They had become more than victims, more than names on a list of the dead. They had become symbols of a loss that demanded change, catalysts for legal and policy developments that might prevent other families from suffering as theirs had suffered. Their lives, cut short by violence that should have been prevented, would not be forgotten. And in that remembrance, there was a form of meaning that transcended the horror of their deaths, a testament to the power of memory to outlast even the most devastating tragedy. The Oxford High School shooting and the prosecutions that followed marked a turning point in how American society approached questions of parental responsibility and youth violence. The convictions of James and Jennifer Crumbley established that enabling a shooter could be a crime, that ignoring warning signs could have legal consequences, that parents could not simply wash their hands of responsibility when their children committed violence with weapons the parents had provided. Whether this precedent would lead to fewer shootings, whether the threat of prosecution would motivate parents to be more attentive and more careful, remained to be seen. But the message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. In the aftermath of Oxford, parents would be watching their troubled children more carefully, securing their weapons more diligently, responding to warning signs with greater urgency. The price of negligence had been established, written in the convictions of 2 ordinary parents who had failed in extraordinary ways, and the legal landscape had been permanently altered. The story of the Crumbley family was, in the end, a story about failures, about opportunities missed, and warnings ignored, and lives destroyed by choices that should never have been made. It was a story about a teenager who cried for help and was told to deal with it himself, who was given a weapon instead of treatment, who was sent back to class instead of being taken home on the morning he planned to kill. It was a story about parents who were present but not engaged, who provided material support but not emotional connection, who failed to see what was happening in their own home until it was too late. And it was a story about a community that believed itself safe until violence proved otherwise, that learned the hardest possible lesson about the fragility of the security they had taken for granted. The 4 students who died at Oxford High School deserved better from the adults who were supposed to protect them. The legal system had finally said so, in verdicts that would echo through American jurisprudence for generations to come.